Christian heroes then and now. David Livingstone, Africa's Trailblazer, by Janet and Geoff Benge. Chapter 15. An Easier Route to the Ocean. David Livingstone was a man who kept his word. Though it was 4 months before he was well enough to begin the trek back to Linyanti and with his Makalolo helpers. The trip back was not so fast. The trip to the coast had taken nearly 7 months. The trip back took 1 year. Along the way, David and his men faced many challenges. They arrived at Christmas time at Pungo Ondongo, 160 miles inland from the coast, where David learned of the tragic fate of the Forerunner. The ship on which David had sent his reports and maps back to England had been wrecked on some rocks, and all hands were lost at sea. David prayed a prayer of thanks that he had not taken up the captain's offer to sail aboard. However, since all his papers were lost, he had to set to work rewriting his reports and letters to his family and friends, and redrawing his maps. This held the men up in Pungo Ondongo for several weeks. The expedition also had to endure the entire wet season while traveling. Often the men waded through thigh-deep water for days on end, and it was nearly impossible for them to find a dry spot to sleep. The best they could do was to find a high patch of ground and build up a pile of dirt and mud, lay grass on top of it, and hope that the little island didn't get swamped in the night or attract the curiosity of crocodiles. At last, after 12 months, David Livingstone led his Makalolo helpers home to Linyanti. Chief Sekalutu and the entire tribe were astonished to see them. "It has been so long. I thought you had all been lost," exclaimed the chief. "How many of you have come back to us?" "All of us," replied one of David's helpers. Not one of us was lost. The chief was speechless. Indeed, it was an amazing feat for 28 men to walk more than 2,000 miles through enemy territory, facing countless wild animals, sickness, and harsh weather conditions without a single fatality or defection. A week of dancing, singing, and storytelling followed the men's arrival back at Linyanti. Chief Sekalutu, dressed grandly in the colonel's uniform the governor of Loanda had sent back to him with the men, presiding over the proceedings. Each of the 27 Makalolo men who had made the trip told his story to the village. Never in the history of the tribe had there been so many stories to tell at once. David was humbled to discover that the Makalolos had taken good care of his things while he was gone. The tribe's people had made a shelter for his wagon, and not a single thing had been touched or stolen from the belongings he'd left behind. Most men would have wanted to rest after such an arduous journey, but not David Livingstone. He didn't have time to rest. He had a new mission to undertake. Arab traders at Loanda had told him there was an easier route to the ocean. The Zambezi River and its tributaries, if he followed them, would lead him to the east coast of Africa and the Indian Ocean. David needed to explore this route. A month after arriving back at Linyanti, David was ready to go again. This time, Chief Sekalutu trusted him with 100 of his men and plenty of goods that could be used as gifts and to barter for food along the way. There were also 12 oxen and enough beads to buy a canoe. By November 13th, 1855, they were following the Zambezi River. David and about 40 men traveled in canoes while the rest of the men herded the oxen along the riverbank. Progress was slow but steady. Before long, David heard the men beginning to talk about the smoke that thunders. He had heard the same talk from his guide on his first visit to see the mighty river, and he knew they were talking about the waterfall. This time, he urged the men to show him this legendary place. The group was still 6 miles from the falls when David saw enormous columns of white vapor billowing into the air. David could hear the faint sound of rushing water. The whisper soon turned into a roar as the canoe was swept closer to the edge of the falls. The paddlers skillfully turned the canoe and headed for an island in the middle of the river that overhung the edge of the waterfall. David dared not move a muscle. He knew that one wrong move could throw the canoe off course and send it careening over the edge. The canoe landed safely on the island, and David climbed out. By now, the noise was so thunderous that the men could communicate only by using gestures. The men pushed through the undergrowth to the far end of the island, where David lay flat on his stomach and wiggled his way to the edge. Below him lay the most stunning sight he had ever seen. Sheets of water, 2,000 yards wide, rolled over the edge of the falls and tumbled 300 feet straight down. The thunderous noise vibrated through David's body, and the vapor billowed all around him. David lay there for a long time, taking in the incredible sight, and knowing he was the first white man to see the falls. Finally, David knew he had to pull himself away from the scene. As he wiggled back from the edge of the falls, he felt he had to do something special to mark the spot. He pulled out his pocket knife and found a large tree. Carefully, he carved his initials D.L. and the year 1855 into the trunk. Then he gathered some wild flowering plants and made a little native garden around the base of the tree. Stepping back, David smiled, pleased with his work. Later that evening, David struggled to put into words what he had seen. He wrote, "Pieces of water leap off it in the form of comets with tails streaming behind, till the whole snowy sheets become myriads of rushing, leaping aqueous comets." As he took his navigational readings from the stars, he thought of a name for the falls. He named them the Victoria Falls, after Queen Victoria of England. As much as David would have liked to have stayed and watched the falls some more, he needed to keep moving. This time, he decided to take a northeasterly route overland, cutting out a loop of the Zambezi River that wound south and then east before turning to the northeast again. Much to his surprise, David soon found himself on a high plateau where the soil was fertile and moist, but not waterlogged, and there was an abundance of wild animals. He was certain the land would make good grazing land for cattle. Before long, he had decided it would also be the perfect location for the Northern Missionary Station he wanted to see established. He wrote a letter to the London Missionary Society detailing the land and asking it to send out missionaries as soon as possible before the opportunity to establish a mission station there slipped away. David was convinced he could find a practical route to the coast from there, while a mission station on the plateau could serve as the hub for a vast missionary enterprise in the area. Of course, He had no way to send his letter, so he poked it away in a leather pouch until he encountered civilization again and could mail it. After David became sick again, the expedition's progress slowed. There were days when they couldn't travel at all because David was too ill. And then there were the many enemy villages they passed through. David had to be constantly alert to evil schemes and double-crossing chiefs. Regrettably, he lost 2 of his men within days of each other. One died of fever and the other from a lion attack. As they approached Titi, a Portuguese colony, David became so ill that he sent some of his guides on ahead of him. When the Portuguese army major in Titi heard of David's plight, he immediately sent a contingent of soldiers out to get him. The soldiers escorted David into town with all the fanfare of royalty. However, David was too ill to appreciate any of it. Days later, when he was beginning to feel a little stronger, David had dinner with the major. The 2 men discussed David's travels thus far. David was particularly interested in finding out anything the major might know about the stretch of river he had bypassed after leaving Victoria Falls. The major assured him the river was navigable all the way to the falls, with just a few minor rapids to negotiate. Whether the major had ever seen these minor rapids or not, David never found out, but his casual comment was to result in much frustration for David Livingstone on his next trip. Eventually, David felt strong enough to continue on. Since he knew he could travel the rest of the way by canoe down the river, when most of his Makalolo helpers asked if they could remain in Titi, David agreed. 16 Makalolos and 5 Portuguese soldiers paddled on down the Zambezi River with David. When they neared their destination, most of the remaining Makalolos asked if they could go back to Titi, and David let them. One man, Sekwibu, begged to stay with David. He said he wanted to see the Indian Ocean. While David felt the Makalolos should stay together, in the end he allowed Sekwibu to continue on with him. In May 1856, David Livingstone, Sekwibu, and the 5 Portuguese soldiers arrived at the town of Quillimane in the delta of the Zambezi River. David had mapped the Zambezi along most of its course from near Linyanti to its end at the Indian Ocean. Now, he was sure that missionaries and Christian traders could penetrate deep inland, opening up areas that had only been exploited by Arab slave traders until then. In Quillimane, David was welcomed into the home of Colonel Nunes. The colonel had been expecting David and had some good news and some bad news for him. The good news was that a bundle of letters was waiting for him. The bad news was that 5 crewmen from the British ship Dart had drowned while negotiating the sandbars at the mouth of the river. The crewmen were returning to the ship after making a special trip to deliver David's mail. David was too sad to read the letters right away, but eventually he did open them. It seemed hollow praise when Roderick Murchison of the Royal Geographic Society wrote that David's first trip to the Atlantic Ocean had been the greatest triumph in geographical research in our times. David also received a letter from a publisher in London named John Murray, who said he was interested in publishing a book about David's travels in Africa. There were no letters, though, from Mary or his family, which caused David to begin to wonder whether he ought to go home to Scotland and see how everyone was. Once he added up his time spent traveling, he was astounded to find it had been nearly 4.5 years since he had seen his family off in Port Elizabeth. David secured passage on the HMS Frolic to the island of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean, where he would catch a steamer headed north into the Red Sea. When it came time for him to leave, Sekwebu once again begged to go with him. David was not enthusiastic, but in the end he gave in, and the two men climbed into a long boat for the perilous ride over the sandbar to where the ship was anchored. The men made it to the HMS Frolic in one piece. But it was a rough trip to Mauritius. About halfway there, Sekwebu began acting very strangely. The captain warned David that Sekwebu was going mad from being on the ocean so long and suggested he be shackled for his own safety. Although David could see that something was seriously wrong with Sekwebu, he could not bear to see his friend shackled like a slave. Regrettably, that night, Sekwebu jumped overboard and drowned in the Indian Ocean, the ocean he had longed to see. David was very depressed about Sekwebu's death and chided himself for not taking the captain's advice. In Mauritius, David transferred to a steamer headed for Egypt via the Red Sea. As he crossed Egypt on his way to the Mediterranean Sea to catch still another steamer that would take him the rest of the way to Scotland, David intercepted a letter addressed to him. This letter was from his mother. David hoped it would cheer him up after Sekwebu's death, but the letter contained more bad news. David's father had died. David was devastated. He tormented himself with questions. Should he have gone home earlier? Were Mary and the children all right? What would he make it home before something else bad happened? When the steamer he was traveling on had to dock in Marseilles, France for emergency repairs, David became obsessed with getting home as soon as possible. He could not wait for the ship to be repaired, and he caught a train across France and a ship across the English Channel. David had sent a message on ahead, and when he arrived in Southampton from France, Mary and the children were waiting for him. Waves of relief swept over David as he hugged his wife and children. They all looked fine and healthy, although 5-year-old Zuga hung back and would not look his father in the eye. David couldn't blame him. He knew he was a stranger to his children. David discovered, to his dismay, that Mary had not adjusted to staying in Scotland. She couldn't seem to get along with David's family, and in the end, she had left the children there and returned to London to stay with friends of her parents. She hadn't talked to David's family in over 6 months. David was devastated. All the time he had been trudging through the jungles and deserts of Africa, he had imagined his family happy and comfortable back in Scotland. Now it seemed the family had been anything but. David Livingstone was very much in demand in London. Within days of arriving in England, he was invited to a meeting of the Royal Geographical Society, where he was honored with a gold medal. It was a complete surprise to David, who did not know what to say when he was asked to respond. After living so long among the Africans and speaking their dialects, he was not used to speaking English. Still, he had to say something. He cleared his throat. As he looked out on the assembled crowd, he spotted Cotton Oswell and Thomas Steele, his 2 old friends, and their presence gave him the courage to speak. "I am only doing my duty as a missionary and opening up a part of Africa to the sympathy of Christ," David said, looking squarely at the audience. "I am only just now buckling my armor for the good fight. I have no right to boast of anything. I will not boast until the last slave in Africa is free and Africa is open to honest trade and the light of Christianity." With that, he bowed and left the podium. An uproar of applause exploded, and everyone in the room rose to his feet. After the meeting, many people congratulated David, including John Murray, who was never more eager than ever to have David Livingstone write a book. David spent a great deal of time speaking in churches throughout England and Scotland on behalf of the London Missionary Society, urging more people to become missionaries to Africa. At the same time, the LMS was urging David to return to Africa and open a mission station of his own. It admired David's explorations and attempts to find trade and travel routes, but it did not share his enthusiasm that they would help spread the gospel message. Missionaries needed mission stations to be effective, it told him. All this made David think hard. His heart was really in trying to open up the Zambezi River area to trade and the gospel message. It was then that David Livingstone received two amazing offers. One was an official government position in Africa that came with the title of Her Majesty's Consul at Quillimane for the Eastern Coast and Independent Districts of the Interior. Along with the position came a salary of 500 pounds a year, 5 times his missionary salary. The second offer was a publishing agreement to write a book to be called Missionary Travels and Researches in South Africa. After thinking things over, David resigned from the London Missionary Society and accepted both offers. He felt it would be the most useful to the spread of Christianity in Africa to open up the Zambezi River as a highway for trade and the spread of the gospel message. Before returning to Africa to take up his new position, though, he settled in the London suburb of Chelsea with his family, where he set to work writing his book. The book took 6 months to complete. It contained 687 pages of maps, stories, journal entries, and observations, and it was an instant bestseller. The first printing of 12,000 copies was all ordered in advance and sold before a single book ever made it to a store. The book went straight into a second printing. Charles Dickens penned one of hundreds of reviews of the book. He wrote, "A narrative of great dangers and trials encountered in a good cause by an honest and courageous a man as ever lived." Privately, David told Mary he would sooner cross Africa again than write another book. However, the income the book generated gave the Livingstones more money than they had ever had before, and David knew just what to do with it. He would pay for his 3 oldest children to stay with his mother and sisters in Scotland, where they could attend the best schools. He and Mary, along with Zuga, who was not yet in school, would return to Africa to take up his new position as Queen Victoria's representative and explore the Zambezi River. Much to his surprise, Queen Victoria asked for a private audience with David. They chatted together for half an hour about his travels. When it was time to leave, David told Queen Victoria he was glad to have met her. Wherever he went in Africa, the natives were shocked that he had never met his big chief. This amused the Queen, who inquired as to what else they asked. "Well," said David, "they ask me if you are very rich, and when I say yes, they press me to tell them how many cows you own." Queen Victoria burst into hearty laughter, and David left Buckingham Palace feeling he had made a new friend. On March 10th, 1858, David and Mary Livingstone and their youngest son left to return to Africa aboard the Pearl. Between the pages of his Bible, David had tucked a poem Mary had given him the first night he arrived back in England 15 months before. The last verse read, "You'll never part me, darling. There's a promise in your eye. I may tend you while I'm living. You will watch me when I die. And if death but kindly lead me to the blessed home on high, what 100,000 welcomes will await you in the sky." They left England with high hopes, but the verse of Mary's poem was to one day become a sad reality for them.